The moment my mother-in-law pointed at the folding chair near the kitchen entrance and said, "You can sit there. We need the dining room seats for real family," I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just stood there in my good dress, the burgundy one I'd ironed twice that morning, and I looked at the chair. It was a cheap folding chair, the kind you rent for $100 when you run out of seats at a party. Plastic legs, thin padding, pushed against the wall next to the trash can. And I thought, she has no idea whose restaurant is feeding everyone in this room tonight. But before I get to that part, you need to understand something. You need to understand why I didn't say a word. Why I folded myself into that chair and sat there for 20 minutes while my husband's family laughed and ate and clinked glasses 10 feet away. Why I had spent 4 years letting them define who I was, even when I knew exactly who I was. My name is Elaine. And that Thanksgiving was the night I stopped apologizing for taking up space. My mother-in-law's name is Dolores. She's the kind of woman who sends birthday cards with handwritten notes that are somehow always slightly insulting. "Hope this year goes better for you, sweetie," and then acts wounded if you don't call to thank her. She has a way of framing every conversation so that she's the one being generous. Inviting you to a holiday dinner becomes a gift she's giving you. Asking about your work becomes a sacrifice of her time. She is not cruel in any obvious way. She is something more difficult. She is relentlessly, cheerfully dismissive. When my husband Connor and I got married 6 years ago, his mother smiled through the whole ceremony and then spent the reception telling her friends that Connor had such a good heart, taking on so much. I was standing right there. I heard her. I pretended I hadn't. That set the tone for everything that followed. Connor's family had a particular way of seeing me. His sister Renata had married a cardiologist. His brother had married a woman who came from old Philadelphia money. And then there was Connor, who had brought home Elaine, the girl who grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Allentown, whose parents worked double shifts, who had put herself through culinary school on student loans and a catering job that paid $12 an hour. They were never mean about it exactly. That's what made it so difficult to push back against. It was always just slightly condescending. Questions about whether I was still doing the cooking thing. Comments about how fun it must be to work in food. Dolores once described my career to a neighbor as, "Elaine helps out at restaurants." At that point, I had been running my own kitchen for 2 years. But I let it go. I always let it go. Because what was the alternative? Making a scene at a family dinner? Proving them right that I was difficult? So I became the version of myself they expected. Quiet at gatherings. Helpful in the kitchen when Dolores allowed it, which wasn't often, because she had very specific ideas about how holiday meals should be prepared, and they did not involve input from the person who had spent 10 years studying food professionally. I attended every birthday, every holiday, every Sunday dinner they expected us at. I brought flowers and wine and left with a tight smile and a headache. Connor tried in his way. He would squeeze my hand under the table when his mother said something particularly pointed. He would tell me later that she didn't mean it, that she was from a different generation, that it was just how she was. He wasn't wrong, but he also wasn't quite right, because the fact that it was just how she was didn't make it hurt any less. It just made it unaddressable. You cannot confront someone for being themselves. You can only decide how much of it you're willing to absorb. For 4 years, I absorbed a lot. The thing about being underestimated is that it has a cost nobody talks about. Not just the obvious cost, the sting in the moment, the grinding down of your confidence over time. There is a subtler cost. The energy you spend performing smallness. Smiling when you want to correct someone. Staying quiet when you want to speak. Watching your achievements evaporate in rooms full of people who have already decided they know who you are. That energy doesn't disappear. It has to come from somewhere. And for 4 years, it came from the part of me that should have been building something. But I was building something. They just didn't know about it. 2 years before that Thanksgiving, I had left my head chef position at a well-regarded restaurant in Center City and taken the risk I'd been calculating for a long time. I opened my own place. Not a casual neighborhood spot, a proper restaurant. The kind that required investors and a liquor license and 3 months of 18-hour days before we ever served a single customer. We specialized in modern American cuisine with Southern influences, the food I grew up eating and then spent a decade learning how to elevate. The kind of menu where every ingredient has a story and every dish has a reason. The first 6 months were brutal. There were weeks when I lay awake running numbers that didn't add up, wondering if I'd made a catastrophic mistake. My general manager, a woman named Audrey, who had been in the industry twice as long as me, would come in on her days off just to help us get through service when we were slammed. My sous chef, a 24-year-old named Trevor, who I'd taken a chance on, turned out to have the most precise, nice skills I'd ever seen. We built something together, not just a restaurant, but a team that actually believed in what we were doing. By the second year, we had a following. By the end of year 2, we were on a list in Philadelphia Magazine. A reviewer from the Inquirer came in twice and wrote something that made me sit in my car in the parking lot and cry for 10 minutes before I was composed enough to go back inside. We were not famous. We were not a household name. But in the industry, people knew us. People who mattered knew us. None of this had made it back to Connor's family. Not because I hit it exactly. I mentioned the restaurant. I said things were going well. But they heard going well the way they heard everything I said about my work, with the particular selective attention of people who have already filed you under not relevant. Dolores once asked Connor in front of me whether I was still doing the catering. I had not done catering since I was 23. I let it pass. Here's the part I didn't know until 3 weeks before that Thanksgiving. Dolores had decided to have the holiday at her house in Bryn Mawr. 40 people. She wanted it catered. She had been hosting Thanksgiving for 30 years, and she said she was tired, which, fine, I understood that. What she wanted was something elevated, something her friends would talk about. She asked Connor's sister Renata to handle the arrangements because Renata had taste and knew the right people. Renata, who lived on the main line and regularly attended charity dinners and galas and the kind of events where the food actually mattered, had reached out to several catering companies and restaurants. She wanted someone who could do a proper Thanksgiving spread, but with a contemporary edge. She sent inquiries to our website's catering form. Our catering coordinator, a meticulous woman named Dawn, handled all initial inquiries. Dawn didn't know Renata's last name was the same as mine. I was still going by my maiden name professionally, which I had done since before we married. It hadn't seemed worth changing on the business side. Dawn put together a proposal. Renata approved it. A deposit was made. By the time I saw the client file and recognized the address, the Bryn Mawr house I had sat in for 6 Thanksgivings, contracts had been signed. I stood in my office for a long time looking at that address. I could have called Dawn. I could have passed the account to someone else, cited a conflict, found a graceful exit. Part of me wanted to. The other part that had been sitting in folding chairs and swallowing corrections for 4 years was very, very quiet and very, very curious. I kept the account. I didn't tell Connor. I told myself it was because I wanted to see if we could execute perfectly regardless of the personal circumstances. I told myself I was being professional. I was also, if I'm being honest, a little curious about how they would treat my food when they didn't know it was mine. Thanksgiving morning, I was at the house in Bryn Mawr by 9 a.m. We had a full team, 2 cooks, a server, and Audrey supervising front of house. I was there as executive chef, which meant I was there as myself, just not the version of myself Dolores' family associated with the name Elaine. I wore my chef's coat with the restaurant name on the left chest. My hair was up. I was, for all practical purposes, invisible to the people walking through Dolores' front door because I was wearing the costume of someone who worked there rather than someone who belonged there. Nobody looked twice at me. I moved through the kitchen, making adjustments, checking temperatures, tasting the gravy, monitoring the timing of 3 different proteins. Dolores came into the kitchen once, around 11:30, to inspect. She walked past me without acknowledgement. She asked Audrey whether the woman in charge was on site. Audrey said yes, she was working in the kitchen right now. Dolores looked around, looked at me, looked back at Audrey, and said, "Wonderful. Tell her the cranberry sauce should go on the left side of the table. That's where we always put it." Then she left. I put the cranberry sauce on the left side. The guests arrived around noon. I stayed in the kitchen, the way I always do during service, managing the line, making sure everything went out correctly, doing the work. Through the kitchen door, I could hear the particular sounds of a party with money and self-congratulation. Heavy silverware against good china, the kind of laughter that carries. Connor's voice somewhere in the middle of it. Renata's husband holding court about something medical. Dolores thanking people for coming as though she personally had curated their presence. Around 1:30, Connor came through the kitchen looking for more ice. He stopped when he saw me. His face went through several things in quick succession: confusion, recognition, something that looked almost like alarm. Elaine. Hey. What are you? Is this your restaurant? It's our catering operation, yes. He stood there for a moment. Does my mom know? Renata made the arrangements through our website. Don handled the booking. Nobody connected the names. He processed this slowly. Were you going to tell anyone? I handed him the ice bucket I'd already prepared. I was focused on the food. He took the bucket. He looked at me for another moment. Then he went back out to the party, and I watched through the door as the afternoon continued. It was around 3, between the main course and dessert, when Dolores made her toast. She was pleased with everything. The food had been, according to the fragments I heard through the door, spectacular. Better than any catering they'd had. Whoever Renata found was talented. Dolores had already told 2 people that she would have them back for Christmas. She was proud of herself for the choice. I heard all of this. Then one of Dolores's friends, a woman who apparently knew the Philadelphia food scene, said something I couldn't fully hear. But I heard Dolores's response, I'm not sure. Some restaurant in the city, Renata handled it. And then the friend said something else. And there was a pause. Audrey appeared in the kitchen doorway. She was doing her best to look professional and neutral, but I could see something moving behind her eyes. Elaine. Someone just connected the name. I already knew. I'd heard the pause. I took off my apron. I straightened my chef's coat. I walked out of the kitchen. The dining room table seated 20 on each side, and it went quiet the way a room goes quiet when something unexpected has just been confirmed. Dolores was at the head. She was looking at me with an expression I had never seen her wear before. Disoriented. The competent, organizing, everything in its right place mask had slipped, just slightly. I didn't walk to her. I walked to the center of the room because it was the most natural position from which to address a group, and I said, calmly, I think some of you might have just figured out who made your dinner tonight. A few people laughed, uncertain. For those who don't know me, I'm Elaine, Connor's wife. I also own the restaurant that catered this meal. I let that settle. We were glad to do it. The food was personal. I looked at Dolores then. She had not moved. Renata was staring at her plate. Connor was watching me from his seat with an expression I couldn't quite decode. Something between pride and held breath. I wasn't angry. That's the part I want to be clear about because I know how this kind of story sounds, and I don't want to misrepresent what I felt in that moment. There was no triumph in it. Not exactly. It was something quieter. It was a feeling of occupying my own space for the first time in a very long time. Of being in a room and not adjusting my size to fit what someone else needed me to be. I hope everyone enjoyed it, I said. Happy Thanksgiving. I went back into the kitchen. The next hour was the most professionally focused hour I had in recent memory. We broke down service, packaged leftovers in the labeled containers we always provided, cleaned the kitchen to the standard we hold ourselves to at the restaurant. My team moved with the practiced efficiency of people who have worked together long enough to not need to say much. I was grateful for that. I needed something to do with my hands. Renata came into the kitchen about 40 minutes into breakdown. She stood near the door for a moment and then said, I didn't know. I want you to know that. When I made the booking, I didn't know. I know you didn't. The food was, she paused. It was really exceptional, Elaine. It was the first time she had used my name and a compliment in the same sentence without adding something that took the compliment away. I thanked her. I meant it. Dolores did not come into the kitchen. Connor stayed close by, helping my team carry things to the van when we were done, which was not something he needed to do, but which I understood was his way of participating in something he didn't quite have words for yet. On the drive home, we were quiet for a while. The city lights came up as we crossed back into Philadelphia, and he said, I should have said something. A long time ago. I should have made it clearer with my family, who you were. I didn't say anything right away. We drove another few blocks. I know, I finally said. I'm sorry. I believed him. He was sorry. I was also not entirely ready to let go of the 4 years of folding chairs and carefully swallowed words, and I thought it was important not to pretend otherwise. So I said that too. that I heard him, that we were going to need more than one conversation, that I loved him, and that it wasn't simple. He nodded. He kept his eyes on the road. The thing that changed after that Thanksgiving wasn't dramatic. It didn't resolve cleanly into some before and after that I could point to. Dolores called the following week. She asked for the restaurant's contact information because she wanted to book us for her book club dinner in January. She did not directly apologize. She did not refer to what had happened at the table, but she used a tone I hadn't heard from her before. Careful, slightly formal, the tone you use with someone whose opinion of you matters to you. I gave her the information. I said we'd be glad to help. It was not forgiveness exactly. It was a door left open. I'm still deciding how often I want to walk through it. What I know is this. I had spent 4 years making myself smaller in that family's presence because I believed on some level that their opinion of me was something I needed to earn. I showed up to every gathering trying to fit into the shape they expected, and it cost me something I cannot fully name, some version of myself that was more confident, more present, less apologetic. What Thanksgiving gave me was not their approval. I didn't get that. What I got was something I should have given myself years earlier, the knowledge that I didn't need it. My restaurant had a full book through December. We hired 2 additional servers for the holiday season. Trevor got promoted to head of our prep team. Audrey started talking about the possibility of a second location, and I started, for the first time, allowing myself to think seriously about what that would look like. I thought about all the energy I had spent in those 4 years trying to be palatable to people who hadn't asked a single genuine question about my life, about the dinners I'd attended as background noise and the achievements I'd mentioned into silence, about the folding chair by the trash can and the moments I'd sat in it without protest. I was done with that, not with a bang, not with the declaration anyone witnessed, just done. The way you close a door quietly behind you because you've already decided you're not going back. There's a specific kind of freedom that comes from being truly seen by the people who should have seen you all along, and discovering that you built something extraordinary without it. I had been building my whole life. The restaurant, the team, the reputation in the only room where it had ever really mattered, which was the room I ran. It turned out the approval I'd been looking for at a table in Bryn Mawr was never necessary. The table I sat at every day was the one I'd made myself, and that one had a very good chair. I've thought a lot about what kind of person sits in a folding chair by a trash can without saying a word. For a long time, I thought that person was weak, accommodating to the point of self-erasure. I used to replay that moment. Dolores' hand, the casual gesture toward the wall, the chair, and feel something hot and complicated that I didn't have a clean name for. But here's what I've come to understand, and it took me longer than it should have. The woman who sat in that chair wasn't weak. She was paying attention. She was building something. She was in the middle of a decade of unglamorous, honest work that nobody in that dining room had bothered to ask about. The silence I kept at those family dinners wasn't surrender. It was patience, even if I didn't frame it that way at the time. What I know now is that character accumulates quietly. Every 18-hour day at the restaurant, every service where something went sideways and I figured it out, every time I chose to do the work instead of complaining about the circumstances, that was me building a foundation that didn't require Dolores' approval to stand on. She didn't know about any of it. That turned out to be fine. The work didn't need her to witness it. It happened anyway. There's something about that I think is worth sitting with. The people who dismiss you. They are not, in the end, the ones who determine what you become. Dolores had decided who I was before she ever saw what I could do. That was her failure of curiosity, not a verdict on my worth. And I had spent 4 years accepting her verdict as though it meant something. That's the part I take responsibility for. Not for her behavior. For mine. For the energy I spent trying to be palatable to someone who had already made up her mind. What I couldn't have told you then, sitting in that chair, is that the way you respond to being underestimated matters more than the underestimation itself. I didn't react. I didn't argue. I went back into the kitchen and I cooked. And then eventually, because I had done the work and told the truth and let the facts be what they were, the room went quiet in a completely different way. That's not luck. That's not some invisible force balancing scales. That's just cause and effect, playing out at its own pace. The choices you make accumulate. Dolores' choices, Years of dismissal, of real family and folding chairs, those accumulated too. They accumulated into a Thanksgiving where every person at her table eventually learned that the woman she'd pointed toward the trash can had fed them all. I didn't plan that. I didn't engineer it. I just kept going. And that, maybe, is the only thing I'd want someone to take from any of this. You don't need to announce yourself. You don't need to fight for recognition in rooms that have already decided you're not worth it. You need to do your work, tell your truth, and trust that reality is more stubborn than other people's assumptions. It always catches up. Every time. The table I set for myself. The one I built over 10 years with Trevor and Audrey, and every difficult service and every risk that scared me. That table turned out to be the only one that mattered. Everything else was just noise I was learning to stop listening to.